Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture. Today, we continue our discussion of free will, and in particular, today we're going to consider the question whether free will or the ability to do otherwise, or the lack of ability to do otherwise, or the lack of free will, is consistent with moral responsibility. And in particular, we're going to consider Harry Frankfurt's views, according to which moral responsibility is compatible with the inability to act otherwise. So maybe let's start by getting some terms in place. So the first term or phrase or principle really that we're going to be discussing, it's called the principle of alternative possibilities. And according to this principle, a person is morally responsible for what they have done only if they could have done otherwise. And you can kind of see the appeal and the intuition behind this principle. If you were or somebody were to hurt or harm another person, part of the reason why we think that they are responsible is because they could have refrained from harming them, right? And you can see how this ties in with the question of determinism. If, according to determinism, as we saw from our last lecture, there are factors in the past which determine the future, such as, for example, whether somebody's going to harm somebody else, then it seems like they cannot act otherwise. And if that's the case, then it seems like they're not morally responsible for committing said action. So that's the way in which this principle seems to relate to the question about determinism and free will. One way of thinking about free will, although it's not the only way of thinking about free will, is to say that somebody has free will just in case they're able to act otherwise, right? So I have free will just in case I can choose at this very second to clap or not to clap, right? And so I clapped, but I could have done otherwise. I could have not clapped, and so I have free will. And that's the way that conceptually the idea of free will ties in with moral responsibility. Okay, so the incompatibilist view says that moral responsibility and determinism are incompatible, right? So this is what the principle of alternative possibilities seems to suggest. It seems to suggest a form of incompatibilism, again, between moral responsibility and determinism for the reasons that we just discussed. Because it seems like if you are determined to act in a certain way, then you are and cannot act otherwise, then you're not morally responsible for that. Frankfurt is going to argue that the principle of alternative possibilities is false. That is, that a person can be morally responsible even if they could not have done otherwise. And by doing so, he's going to be arguing for a form of compatibilism. That is, that moral responsibility and a way of thinking about determinism are compatible. And the way that he's going to argue for this is by cases. And we'll discuss this in a second. But first, before we talk about Frankfurt's argument against the principle of alternative possibilities, I think it's useful for us to even consider, why do people even think that the principle of alternative possibilities is true? And I kind of have suggested already an intuitive case, but more specifically, think about, for example, coercion. So what is coercion? What does it mean for somebody to be coerced? What would it mean for somebody to coerce a person into acting a certain way? Well, normally we think that a person is coerced when they are forced to do something, right? Think about the example, and this is the example that we're going to be thinking about for the remainder of this class. Think about somebody who has a gun to another person's head. So if somebody has a gun to your head, for example, and they tell you that if you don't give them your wallet, then they will shoot you, you are being coerced to hand over your wallet, right? You're not doing it freely, right? You're not consenting. Similarly, if they are, for example, if you have a gun to your head, or somebody has a gun to your head, and they tell you to do something harmful to another person, maybe pull somebody's hair or something like that, or maybe you shoot them, then it seems like you were coerced to do that bad action. But because you were coerced, you are not morally responsible, right? So we can kind of see the connection with the principle of alternative possibilities here, because the principle of alternative possibilities would just say, see, that's why you're not morally responsible in this case of coercion, because you're being forced to act in a certain way you could not have done otherwise. And that's why you're not morally responsible. Because remember, according to the principle of alternative possibilities, you're not responsible unless you can act otherwise. However, according to Frankfurt, there is another principle here actually at work that is actually different from the principle of alternative possibilities. And we can call this the coercion principle. According to the coercion principle, if A is coerced to do X, then A is not responsible for X, right? So again, if somebody is coerced to harm another person, then they're not responsible for harming that person. Now, I have said that many people, and like people against whom Frankfurt is arguing, think that this principle of coercion just is an instance of the principle of alternative possibilities, right? But according to Frankfurt, this is false. According to Frankfurt, the coercion principle is actually separate from the principle of alternative possibilities. And we'll discuss how he developed various cases to make this distinction. Because Frankfurt does believe in the coercion principle. He does believe that if a person is coerced to do something, then they are not responsible. But he believes that the principle of alternative possibilities is false. That is, that somebody could be more responsible just in case they cannot act otherwise. Now, something about coercion for us to begin to think about is this idea that coercion, right, is being forced. And the idea there is that you have to have an inner compulsion, right, which drives you to do something. And that level of psychological force is what determines the level of coercion, right? Again, we discussed the idea of somebody who's being coerced by having a gun to their head. Now, because most people want to live and are afraid of dying, that threat exerts a tremendous amount of pressure, which forces the person to act in a particular way. But it's worth noting that that can differ, right? There are different forms of coercing someone. They're legitimate forms of coercing, but that we don't think, or we tend to not think, that they involve a sufficient level of force that would render them not responsible for an action. So, for example, suppose that somebody makes a threat to you, that if you don't shoot somebody else, right? So they want to force you to shoot somebody else, but their threat is that if you don't shoot them, they're going to pinch you. Okay, that is a coercive threat, right? Like, it's a threat. Like, if you don't do something, I'm going to do something that you don't want, namely to be pinched. But if you did act on that threat, that is, if you did shoot that person, even if you didn't want to, it's very dubious that you would not be morally responsible for that, right? As in, like, we would think that you're morally responsible for shooting someone, and you cannot respond to that judgment by saying, but I was coerced, like, that he said he was going to pinch me. And part of the reason why that doesn't work is because we normally don't think that a pinch, or the threat of a pinch, elicits a sufficient amount of psychological force or pressure that would make you actually kill someone. So the key here then about coercion going forward, when we discuss the rest of the cases, is this idea of psychological pressure. All right. And so again, one way of thinking about Frankfurt's argument is that the coercion principle is true, that coercion, legitimate instances of coercion, do render the person not responsible for the action, but that the coercion principle is not an instance of PAP. So he thinks that that's false. All right, so we're going to go through various examples and just some preliminaries about all of these examples. So I made them a little bit more precisified than the examples that actually are in the article because I think it makes it easier to digest. But these are the features which all the examples have in common, just for us to think about this. So, in all of these examples, we're going to think about Jones deliberating. That means thinking, considering various options, various reasons, and deciding ultimately to shoot Sarah. And you can think about what these reasons might be, right? Maybe he hates Sarah, maybe Sarah has done something to him in the past, and he just wants to shoot Sarah. Okay, so he deliberates, he forms the intention, and decides to shoot Sarah. Okay? However, there's this other person, Smith, who also actually hates Sarah and who wants Jones to kill Sarah. Okay? So again, this is going to be consistent across all cases. And because Smith wants Jones to shoot Sarah, Smith threatens Jones with a gun to his head. We'll just suppose. Again, that's not quite the example in the text, but I think it makes it much easier to discuss these examples and their implications when we have a precisified example. So again, Jones deliberates and decides to shoot Sarah. Smith also hates Sarah and wants Jones to kill Sarah. And, it's possible, most likely, that Smith just doesn't know that Jones has already decided to kill Sarah, right? And so Smith threatens Jones by putting a gun to his head. And the question that we're going to be asking in all of these examples, and there are 4 of them, is Jones responsible for shooting Sarah? And as we will see, it depends on various features, according to Frankfurt. Okay? So let's start with Jones 1. And this is what Frankfurt calls the indifferent agent. So in this case, as in all the other cases, again, Jones 1 decides to shoot Sarah, and he would do it no matter what. What that means is that he is laser focused on shooting Sarah, and he doesn't care about anything else. What that implies is that even if Smith threatened Jones, he would ignore, or he does ignore, the threat completely. So maybe think about Jones. Maybe one way of thinking about this example again is think about, in this case, Jones just being very desperate or nihilistic, quite frankly, where he doesn't even care about his life. Maybe he just, maybe he was, I don't want to say he was planning on killing himself because I might mess up the example, but he just does not care about his life. He only is focused on completing this one purpose, this one task, and that is to kill Sarah. And so Smith issues the threat to Jones, and it just goes over Jones's head. He doesn't care about the threat to his life, and he wants to kill Sarah. So and suppose that he does kill Sarah in that case. The first question then is Jones morally responsible? And the answer should be yes, right? He seems to be morally responsible, right? And what's interesting, actually, what's really interesting is that if this was like a legal case in reality, because we don't have access to Jones' inner workings, this would probably a case where a jury might seek to excuse Jones' murder, because after all, there's video evidence of Smith holding a gun to Jones's head, right? And so maybe they would say, oh, he's coerced, right? But that's the question, right? This does not seem, according to Frankfurt, to be a case of coercion because the threat had no impact on him, right? Remember what I had said earlier about the difference between the threat of being pinched and the threat of one's life ending. It matters. It depends on the person's personal psychological makeup, what they care about, whether a threat is actually coercive or not. Different people under different circumstances, different threats will constitute different levels of coercion in that case. And in this case, so this case just establishes that this is not a case of coercion, right? And in principle, he could have done otherwise because the threat had no force. So this is not a counterexample to the principle of alternative possibilities. It just shows that coercion didn't actually operate, right? That there's a way to think about coercion and did not actually operate here. Okay, so this is the first example, and it kind of again helps us to start thinking about responsibility and how coercion kind of plays into that case, because this is not a case of coercion. Okay, now Jones 2 is called the Stampede case, and I'll talk about in a second why it's called a Stampede case. So again, Jones 2, Jones receives a threat from Smith, and Jones becomes terrified of Smith's threat. Like Jones deliberates and wants to kill Sarah, right? He decides to kill Sarah, but I guess he was unaware, and Smith comes into the picture with a gun to his head. And unlike the first case, in this case, Jones greatly cares about living and is very afraid of death and becomes absolutely terrified of that prospect of dying. And it's Jones's fear of dying that leads him to actually kill Sarah instead of his prior decision. So in this case, according to Frankfurt, it is a clear case of coercion, and Jones is not morally responsible because of the coercion principle, because he was coerced into killing Sarah. Now, you might think, and not unreasonably, and be like, well, I don't know. I mean, are we sure that he's not morally responsible? I mean, after all, he did decide, he deliberated, and he had the intention to kill Sarah, and then Joe kind of comes in and kind of completes the link to killing her. So are we sure that he's not responsible here? And you could have that intuition, and like I said, that intuition is not unreasonable, but I think that's what's useful for us to really think about what is happening here, and in particular, the idea that what it means for Jones to have deliberated and to have decided to kill someone, and how that process in itself does not elicit blame, right? Let me change the example a little bit. Suppose instead, again, so Jones deliberates and decides to kill Sarah. So he's decided to kill Sarah. And right when he's about to kill Sarah, let's suppose that it's in a public space. Sarah gets run over by a bus. Just a freak accident. Well, we wouldn't say in that case that Jones is responsible for killing Sarah, right? Even though he had decided to kill Sarah. There seems to be a necessary connection between that decision and the action and the causal link for us to render Jones responsible. And it seems like in a similar way, in this case, he decides to kill Sarah, but much like the bus hitting Sarah, the thread just kind of stampedes all of his deliberation and psychology and kind of breaks the connection between his decision and the action, and the fear and the threat is really the causal factor and the motivational factor, which ultimately ends up being expressed in the action. And for that reason, Jones in this case, according to Frankfurt, is not morally responsible. All right. So again, Jones 2 is not responsible for the action. And this is a clear case of coercion, right? Not because at least the alternatives were closed. Now, this is not a counterexample yet, because so Frankfurt wants to say, okay, we can say that this is a case in which he's responsible, but it's because of coercion. Now, of course, the person who's defending the principle of alternative possibilities can still assert and be like, yeah, and part of the reason is because he couldn't do otherwise, because he was so filled with fear from the threat that he was unable to act otherwise. So at this point of the argument, the defendant or the defender of the principle of alternative possibilities can still hold their own. It is the next case where it really becomes more difficult for the defender of PAP to defend against Frankfurt. But as we'll see in the next example, these two examples were necessary for us to really grasp how Jones 3 is a counterexample to the principle of alternative possibilities. So here is Jones 3, and we can call this, or Frankfurt I think calls this, the key intermediate case. And here's how it goes. So Jones 3 has already decided to perform the action before the threat is issued. Again, same description as the previous two. The difference is that unlike the first case, remember, the first case is where Jones is completely indifferent, nihilistic, does not care about his life. Unlike that case, in this case, the threat, he does care about the threat. Like, he wants to live, and he's irresistible, meaning that that level of threat would suffice to force him to act in any particular way. Suppose, for example, that Smith instead threatened Jones to kill somebody that Jones doesn't hate, like Emily, some random person. That threat would suffice to make Jones do that. Like, he would succumb to that force, and he would kill Emily or some random bystander. So in that case, so this is a completely different case from the first Jones example. He would succumb, if necessary, to the threat. But, and here's the key, but when he actually acts and kills Sarah, he actually acts based on his own reasons. Like, right when he's gonna kill her, he remembers the reasons why he wanted to kill her, and he decides to kill her. And so the decision, the causal link between his decision and his action is actually not severed in this case. And the action that he actually kills her for his own reasons, not because of the threat, even if the threat is present. And so if you think, so what is the verdict here? And I think Frankfurt plausibly says he's guilty. And I think perhaps most of us would say, yes, he's guilty. And yet, so he's morally responsible, and yet he couldn't have acted otherwise. Right? He couldn't have refused not to kill Sarah because, remember, for him, the threat of being killed is sufficient to get him to kill pretty much anybody, including Sarah. So he couldn't not refuse to not kill Sarah because he cares about his life too much. That's the similarity that he has with the second case. And so again, here's a case in which Jones is morally responsible, and yet he cannot act otherwise. And therefore, it's a counterexample to the principle of alternative possibilities. Remember, the principle of alternative possibilities says that in order for you to be morally responsible, you have to be able to act otherwise. But in this case, he was not able to act otherwise because of the force of the threat, and yet we would all say that he is guilty. So that's the way that the counterexample works. Now there is an objection here, which it's a good one, and which Frankfurt anticipates, and which allows them in turn to be able to make this argument even more forceful. So first, let's consider the objection, and let's remind ourselves of the principle of alternative possibilities. So the PAP says a person is morally responsible for what they have done only if they could have done otherwise. Okay, so that's the principle. And the objection goes, but wait 1 second. In Jones 3, Jones could have done otherwise. He could have not killed Sarah, even if he was threatened to do so. That is, the objection here just denies that when Jones is threatened for his life, sure, it exerts pressure on him to kill Sarah, but in principle he could do otherwise, right? Like, he's not logically compelled, or he's not compelled by the laws of physics to kill Sarah. I mean, yes, he wouldn't want to die, but he could in principle have refused and got shot, right? And so in that case, the objector says this is not an actual counterexample to the principle of alternative possibilities because this is a case in which Jones could have actually not killed Sarah, even if he was trying to do so. And this is maybe it's hard to assess this objection on its own, right? Because again, depending on how much he cares, and okay, so here's one way in which we can make this objection even stronger. I can imagine somebody saying that, look, the fact that he was able to act out of his own reasons to kill Sarah, right? Remember that that's ultimately what the argument says, just means that that level of pressure from the coercion must have not been very high. Like if you can literally kind of ignore the threat just even for that second and you actually act out of your decision to kill Sarah, then that coercion almost, you can argue, couldn't have been that great and you in principle could have refused it. Okay. Seems pretty plausible. And as a result, Frankfurt comes up with a fourth example, and this example is what's now considered the Frankfurt case. So if you go on to do more philosophy, which I hope you do in moral philosophy, and you ever come across the term, you'll be reading various literatures, and they will say, oh, this is like so it comes to the Frankfurt case, or they make a reference to the Frankfurt style case. This is the example that they have in mind, and this is now like the standard example. When people talk about Frankfurt style case, they talk about this case, not the other ones, because this one really just kind of makes the point even clearer. And this one will say involves Black and Jones, so we changed the name of the third person. So here's the setup for this Frankfurt style case. So Black, like Smith, wants Jones 4 to perform a specific action. And again, let's stick with shooting Sarah, okay? So Black wants Jones to perform a specific action. Oh, and this is very important. Black is prepared to intervene through manipulation, hypnosis, neural controls, or threats, anything, to ensure that Jones 4 chooses and performs that action. Now, I think in my mind, the best way to think about this is to imagine that Black has let's say, embedded a device in Jones' head that permits Black to take over Jones's neural circuit if necessary. Okay, so you can control it in principle. Okay, and the idea here, and we can suppose that Jones is not even aware of this. Okay, so this is the setup. However, Black knows that Jones wants to kill Sarah, and so Jones he actually prefers not to intervene. Of course, it makes sense. He's like, why would he even get his hands dirty if Jones is, after all, going to carry out what Black wants, right? However, he will intervene if for some reason, so you can imagine this case in which Black is observing Jones as he enters Sarah's house. It's a little bit dark of a thought. But, and as soon as, if for whatever reason Jones decides not to kill Sarah, Black takes over with the device that Black has embedded in Jones' head and kind of, you can imagine, controlling him so that he ends up killing Sarah regardless, right? So that's the setup. But this is what actually happens. So what actually happens? So Jones, as we have said, has reasons to kill Sarah, and so he has deliberated and decided to kill Sarah. Black never intervenes. That is, he actually kills. So Jones kills Sarah, and Black never intervenes. So he never used the device that was embedded in Jones. And yet, Jones could not have done otherwise than to kill Sarah. Why? Because Black would have prevented any alternative. Black would have taken over and made, as it were, Jones kill Sarah. So Jones couldn't have done otherwise than he in fact did. Right? And yet, even if he couldn't have done otherwise, we would still say that Jones is morally responsible. So it seems like Jones, apologies for the typo, is fully morally responsible, but his inability to do otherwise is irrelevant, right? Because that inability played no role in his actual decisions. Nothing about Black's presence explains the action. Jones would have done the same thing anyway, right? And so, therefore, according to Frankfurt, what matters is not that alternative possibilities exist, but rather the motivations behind the action, behind the decision to do something. That is what is the locus of our attributions of moral blameworthiness. It is not whether people have the ability to do otherwise. All right, well, that concludes this argument and this lecture. Thank you for listening.